Before we descend into the concrete labyrinth of Alcatraz and the cold, calculated mind of a man named Walker, I want to ask you a question. Where are you joining us from today? Whether you're watching from a quiet study in New England or a porch in the Southwest, pull up a chair. We're going back to 1967, a year when the world was changing, but one man remained as immovable as a mountain of granite. There is a specific kind of silence that exists only in movies made by men who had seen real combat. It isn't the silence of peace, it's the silence of a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. In 1967, John Boorman's Point Blank didn't just break the rules of the American crime film, it rewrote them in blood and concrete. This wasn't the polished, romanticized noir of the 1940s. This was something colder, something more mechanical. And at the center of it all was Lee Marvin, a man whose face looked like it had been carved out of a canyon wall. If you grew up with the cinema of the 60s, you remember the shift. The Technicolor was getting brighter, but the stories were getting darker. Point Blank is often cited as a masterpiece, but few people talk about the sheer physical and psychological cost of bringing this vision to life. Today, we're stepping behind the lens to uncover 20 facts about the making of this brutalist epic, details that explain why, even 50 years later, no one has been able to replicate its haunting, rhythmic intensity. Let's start with the rock itself. Alcatraz. By 1966, the infamous federal penitentiary had been shuttered for 3 years. It was a rotting carcass of a prison, surrounded by the freezing, treacherous currents of the San Francisco Bay. The production of Point Blank was the first time a film crew was ever permitted to shoot on the island after its closure. But this wasn't a standard location shoot. The cast and crew weren't just visiting. They were haunted by the atmosphere. There was no electricity on the island, no running water. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of the wind whipping through empty cell blocks. Lee Marvin, a decorated WW2 veteran who had survived the horrors of the Pacific Theater, felt a strange kinship with the place. He didn't want a trailer. He didn't want a luxury suite back on the mainland. He spent his time pacing the corridors, soaking in the residual misery of the world's most famous prison. He understood that for his character, Walker, Alcatraz wasn't just a place where he was betrayed. It was the place where he died. And that brings us to the most unsettling theory in all of cinema history. Many critics and scholars argue that Walker never actually left the island. They believe the entire film, the revenge, the corporate takedowns, the reunions, is nothing more than a dying man's fever dream as he bleeds out on the floor of a prison cell. Think about the way the film moves. It's non-linear, it's repetitive, it's dreamlike. When you watch Lee Marvin's footsteps echoing through the Los Angeles airport, he isn't just walking, he's an unstoppable force of nature, a ghost haunting the living. This theory changes everything you think you know about the movie. It transforms a revenge flick into a tragedy about a soul that can't find its way to the other side. But the ghostly nature of the film wasn't just a script choice. It was a directive from Lee Marvin himself. You see, at that point in his career, Marvin had just won an Oscar for Cat Ballou. He had final cut authority, a power almost no actor possessed at the time. When he met the young, largely unknown director John Boorman, Marvin did something legendary. He took the script, threw it out the window, and told Boorman, "I'll give you my services if you promise to do it your way." He used his star power to shield the director from the studio executives who wanted a more traditional movie. He essentially held the studio at gunpoint so that a piece of art could be born. One of the most distinctive elements of the film is the complete lack of wasted breath. Walker barely speaks. In fact, if you count his lines, he has less dialogue than almost any other leading man in a 2-hour film. Why? Because Lee Marvin understood the power of the silhouette. He understood that a man of 60, or a man who has lived a hard life, doesn't need to explain his motives. His presence is the explanation. He told Boorman to cut his lines constantly. If he could convey a feeling with a look or a subtle shift in his posture, the words were deleted. It's a level of confidence we rarely see in modern actors who feel the need to narrate their every emotion. Then there is the color. Most people associate noir with shadows and fog. But Point Blank is a neon noir. It uses a very specific, almost obsessive color palette. Notice how red follows Walker everywhere. It's the color of the betrayal at the beginning. And it's the color that stains the edges of his world as he hunts down his money. This wasn't accidental. The production design was intended to look like a modern office building, cold, glass, and steel, interrupted by the violent intrusion of primary colors. It was a visual representation of the corporate world being shattered by an old-school criminal. In the 1960s, the underworld was changing. The old-fashioned mobsters with fedoras and Tommy guns were being replaced by men in gray flannel suits, men who ran the organization like a Fortune 500 company. This is where the film hits a nerve. Walker isn't just fighting a man who stole his wife and his money. He's fighting a bureaucracy. Oh, he keeps asking for his $93,000, and the corporate bosses keep telling him that the money doesn't exist in cash. It's all accounts and ledgers. For a man like Walker, and perhaps for many of us, this is the ultimate frustration. How do you punch a ghost? How do you collect a debt from a system that has no heart? This tension between the old world man and the new world system is what gives the film its bite. Walker is a relic. He's a dinosaur in a suit that's slightly too tight, walking through a world of glass elevators and modern art that he doesn't understand. And yet, he wins because he is the only one who is truly real. He is the only one willing to pull the trigger in a world that prefers to sign a memo. But as much as the film is about the organization, it's also about the man. And Lee Marvin's real-life history is the secret ingredient that makes the violence in Point Blank feel so heavy. Marvin wasn't a tough guy actor. He was a Marine. He was wounded at the Battle of Saipan. He had seen the worst of humanity, and he brought that cold, analytical survivalism to the screen. When he hits someone in this movie, he doesn't do a Hollywood punch. He strikes with a clinical, terrifying efficiency. There is a scene, perhaps the most famous in the film, where Walker confronts his cheating wife's new lover. He doesn't scream, he doesn't lose his temper, he simply walks. The rhythmic clack, clack, clack of his heels on the floor is the only soundtrack. It's the sound of inevitable doom. We're going to look at how that sound was created, and why it became the heartbeat of the film. But there's a detail about that sequence that almost no one noticed. A detail involving the way the camera was positioned to make Lee Marvin look 7 feet tall. It's a trick of the trade that changed the way action was filmed forever. And yet, for all the technical brilliance, the most weird fact about Point Blank involves a guest on the set who claimed to hear voices in the prison cells of Alcatraz, voices that Lee Marvin refused to ignore. As we move deeper into the organization, things get even stranger. Because while Walker was looking for his money, the actors were dealing with a set that felt like it was cursed. And what happened during the filming of the famous bed scene is something that still puzzles film historians to this day. But we're just getting started. The real secrets of The Rock are about to be revealed, and the true nature of Walker's revenge is far darker than a simple quest for cash. It is often said that the walls of a prison absorb the misery of those they hold. If that's true, then shooting on Alcatraz in 1966 was like filming inside a sarcophagus of broken dreams. But for Lee Marvin, this wasn't just a backdrop, it was a mirror. You see, the character of Walker isn't just a criminal, he is a man who was left for dead by the only people he trusted. And the stark, cold reality of The Rock provided the perfect visual metaphor for his internal state. One of the strangest facts about the production was the sheer physical toll it took on the crew. The island had no heating, and the damp San Francisco fog would roll into the cell blocks, chilling everyone to the bone. Is for an hour at a time, just staring at the darkened cells. Sometimes for an hour at a time, just staring at the peeling green paint. When John Boorman asked him what he was doing, Marvin simply replied, "I'm listening to the guys who didn't make it out." It wasn't a joke. Marvin believed that to play a man who had returned from the dead, he had to inhabit the space where men were sent to be forgotten. This brings us to a detail that almost every casual viewer misses. Look closely at the opening sequence where Walker is shot. He falls back into the shadows of a cell. When he emerges later, the lighting changes entirely. It becomes overexposed, harsh, almost blindingly bright. Some film historians suggest this is the moment the dream begins. Yet the transition from the dark, cold reality of the prison to the bright, synthetic world of Los Angeles is too sharp, too clinical. It's as if Walker's ghost is being projected into a world he no longer belongs to. But let's talk about the organization. In 1967, the idea of a crime syndicate run like a corporate board of directors was terrifyingly new. Before Point Blank, movie gangsters lived in smoky back rooms and wore cheap suits. The villains in this film, however, work in glass skyscrapers. They have secretaries, they have middle managers, they have procedures. When Walker tracks down Stegman or Brewster, he isn't just looking for a fight, he's looking for a transaction. There's a legendary story from the set involving the famous car lot scene. You remember it. The one where Walker takes a car salesman for a terrifying high-speed ride to get information. To get that raw, panicked reaction from the actor playing the salesman, Marvin didn't follow the rehearsal. He drove the car much faster and more erratically than planned, nearly clipping a concrete pillar. The terror you see on that actor's face, that wasn't acting. That was a man who realized he was trapped in a hurtling metal box with a Marine who didn't care if they both crashed. Marvin knew that to get real reactions, you had to create real danger. This brings up an interesting point about the American man of that era. For those of you who served or grew up in the shadow of the Great Generation, you know that men like Marvin didn't talk about trauma, they performed it. Yet the violence in Point Blank isn't stylized like a comic book. It's blunt. It's the violence of a man who wants to finish the job and go home. There is a scene where Walker confronts his wife's sister, Chris, played by the incomparable Angie Dickinson. Their chemistry was electric, but it was also combative. In one of the film's most famous and exhausting sequences, Chris begins hitting Walker. She punches him repeatedly in the chest and face, a flurry of desperate, emotional blows. Walker just stands there. He doesn't flinch, he doesn't move. He lets her exhaust herself until she literally collapses from fatigue. It's a haunting image of masculine stoicism, a man so hollowed out by betrayal that physical pain no longer registers. Interestingly, during the filming of that scene, Dickinson actually bruised her hands on Marvin's chest. He didn't tell her to stop. He wanted the scene to feel heavy. He wanted the audience to feel the weight of his indifference. But behind the scenes, the organization of the film studio was almost as difficult to deal with as the fictional syndicate. MGM executives were horrified by the new wave editing techniques John Boorman was using. They didn't understand why the film jumped around in time. They didn't understand why there was so much silence. They wanted to cut the film into a standard, chronological action movie. This is where the Marvin legend grows even larger. He invited the top brass to a private screening. When the lights came up, the executives started barking orders about changes. Marvin stood up, looked at the most powerful man in the room, and simply walked out. He didn't say a word. And because he had final cut in his contract, his silence was a veto. He protected Boorman's vision with the same cold efficiency Walker used to protect his $93,000. It's a rare moment in Hollywood history where the star used his ego to save the art. Another weird fact, the film almost didn't get shot in San Francisco. The studio wanted to save money by using backlots in Los Angeles. But Boorman and Marvin insisted on the verticality of San Francisco, the hills, the bridges, and the isolation of the bay. They felt that the city's architecture looked like a futuristic prison. If you look at the buildings featured in the film, they are almost all brutalist, lots of raw concrete and sharp angles. It was meant to make Walker look like he was trapped in a maze he couldn't escape, even after he left Alcatraz. And then there's the sound design. Have you ever noticed that the sound of Walker's footsteps is louder than almost anything else in the movie? That was a deliberate choice. The clack of those heels was recorded separately and amplified. Boorman wanted it to sound like a clock ticking down to zero. It's a rhythmic, hypnotic sound that builds an incredible amount of tension without a single note of music. It's the sound of a man who is on point. But here is where things get truly forbidden. There were rumors on the set that Lee Marvin was drinking heavily during the production. Some said it was the only way he could deal with the ghosts of the Pacific that the isolation of Alcatraz brought back to the surface. However, if you look at his performance, there isn't a single sloppy moment. If he was drinking, he used it to fuel that blurry, dreamlike state the character required. He was a professional to the bitter end. He knew that the audience, men who had seen the world, would know if he was faking the intensity. As Walker gets closer to the top of the organization, he realizes that the men at the top don't even know who he is. He's a ghost chasing a debt from a machine that doesn't have a soul. This leads us to the climax at the fort, a place where the past and the present collide in a way that most people find incredibly confusing on their first viewing. But there is a secret hidden in that final scene, a reason why Walker doesn't take the money when it's finally offered to him. It's a detail that relates back to a real-life encounter Marvin had with a soldier during the war, and it changes the entire meaning of the revenge genre. However, before we get to the end of the line, we have to talk about the woman in the middle, because the role of the wife in this film is far more complex than just a femme fatale. She represents the life Walker can never go back to, and the reason why his return from Alcatraz was doomed from the very first step. And what about the mysterious man in the shadows who seems to be guiding Walker? Who is he really? Some say he's a federal agent. Others say he's something far more supernatural. We're about to dive into the most controversial theory about the film's ending. But first, we need to look at what happened to the real $93,000 that was stolen during the heist, because, believe it or not, that plot point was based on a real-life crime that the FBI didn't want the filmmakers to talk about. When we look at the women in Walker's life, we aren't just looking at romantic interests. We are looking at the remnants of his humanity. In most 1960s action films, the Bond girl, or the damsel, was a prize to be won. But in Point Blank, the women are survivors of Walker's own wake of destruction. Take the character of Lynn, Walker's wife, played by Sharon Acker. Her performance is haunting because she barely seems to be there. She moves through her apartment like a ghost in a high-end catalog, surrounded by the modern luxuries bought with the blood money from the Alcatraz heist. There is a weird fact about that apartment set that perfectly illustrates the film's obsession with psychological states. The director, John Boorman, has had the set designers paint the walls in shifting shades of gray and silver. As the scene progresses and Lynn's despair grows, the lighting changes to make the walls seem to close in on her. It was a visual representation of the gilded cage. And then there is the OD, overdose. In the original script, it was much more graphic, much more Hollywood. But Marvin insisted on a quiet, almost cold discovery. He didn't scream, he didn't weep, he just looked at her. And in that moment, you realize Walker isn't just seeking revenge for the money. He's seeking revenge because he has absolutely nothing left to love. This brings us to Chris, played by Angie Dickinson. If Lynn was the past, Chris is the reluctant present. Dickinson was at the height of her beauty and talent here. But Boorman didn't want a glamour girl. He wanted someone who looked like she had been through the professional ringer. One of the most clandestine details about their scenes together is that many of their most intense moments were improvised. Marvin and Dickinson had a shorthand. They didn't need to over-rehearse. They understood the dance of two people who are using each other for a common goal. But there is a sequence involving a telescope that nearly broke the production. It's a moment of voyeurism, where Walker watches the organization from a distance. To get the lighting just right, to capture that Southern California haze that feels like a smog-filled dream, the crew waited for 3 days for the exact atmospheric conditions. Why? because Marvin felt that the haze represented the lack of clarity in the modern world. It gets truly prophetic. In 1967, the idea gets truly prophetic. In 1967, the idea that a criminal enterprise could be so bureaucratic that its leaders didn't even know where the cash was kept seemed absurd. Today, in the era of digital banking and offshore accounts, it feels like a documentary. There is a scene where Walker confronts a high-ranking official named Carter. Walker demands his $93,000. Carter looks at him as if he's speaking a dead language. He explains that the organization doesn't work that way. They don't have suitcases of cash. Everything is credit, ledgers, and accounts. This is the central conflict of the film, the industrial man versus the corporate machine. Walker is a man who understands physical reality, bullets, fists, and cold hard cash. He is being defeated by a system that is invisible. It's a frustration that many men of a certain age feel today. The world has become abstract. We don't fix things with our hands anymore. We click buttons. Walker's crusade is an attempt to force the world to be real again. He wants to touch his money because if he can touch it, it means his betrayal was real. If the money doesn't exist, then his suffering was for nothing. There is a weird fact about the stunt work in this film that you won't find in the official press kits. Because the budget was tight and the final cut was under Marvin's protection, they didn't use many professional stuntmen for the close quarters fighting. That's Lee Marvin actually throwing those punches, and more importantly, that's Lee Marvin actually taking the hits. In the scene where he's ambushed in the penthouse, he took a genuine blow to the ribs that cracked a bone. He didn't call for a medic. He finished the take, walked to his trailer, drank a glass of bourbon, and came back for the next shot. That wasn't toxic masculinity. It was the code of a generation that didn't believe in complaining about the job. But as the body count rises, we have to look at the man in the shadows. Yost. Played by Keenan Wynn, Yost is the one who finds Walker after the heist and points him toward the men who betrayed him. Throughout the film, Yost is always there, in the background, in the shadows, and whispering in Walker's ear like a malevolent angel. There is a deep, forbidden theory among cinema buffs that Yost isn't a government agent at all. Think about it. How does he always know where Walker is? Why does he never get his hands dirty? Some believe Yost is actually a manifestation of Walker's own will to live, or perhaps something darker. Some say Yost is the devil himself, guiding a dead man through purgatory to collect a debt that can never be paid. When you watch the final confrontation at the fort, pay close attention to Yost's reaction when the money finally arrives. He doesn't care about the cash. He cares about the result. And what about that fort? The final scene takes place at Fort Point, right under the Golden Gate Bridge. It's a massive brick-and-mortar structure that looks like something out of the Civil War. In a helicopter, the pinnacle of 1960s in a helicopter, the pinnacle of 1960s tech, and drops the money into this 19th century ruin. It's a collision of eras. But there's a secret about that helicopter. The pilot was a Vietnam vet who had just returned from a tour of duty. During the filming of the money drop, he performed a maneuver that was so dangerous it nearly clipped the walls of the fort. The crew gasped, but Boorman kept the cameras rolling. It added to the sense of chaos. In that moment, the organization showed its true face. They would rather risk a helicopter crash than deal with Walker face to face. And then, the ending. It's one of the most debated endings in film history. The money is there, the enemies are dead or gone. The organization retreat, and then the organization retreat, and then he simply vanishes. He doesn't take a single cent of the $93,000 he spent the whole movie killing for. Why? To understand this, you have to understand Lee Marvin's philosophy. He believed that once Walker realized the money was just paper in a paper world, the quest was over. The money wasn't the point. The point was the blank, the empty space left behind when a man realizes that the world he once knew is gone forever. But there's one more weird fact we haven't touched on. It involves a real-life thief who claimed he was the inspiration for the story, and a lost scene that was edited out of the film because it was considered too perturbing for 1967 audiences. We are about to uncover the final mystery of The Rock. As we reach the final act of this analysis, we have to address the ghost in the room. There is a real-world connection to Point Blank that the studio tried to keep quiet for years. The film is based on the novel The Hunter by Richard Stark, a pseudonym for Donald Westlake. But rumors have long persisted in the criminal underworld of the West Coast that the original heist on Alcatraz wasn't just a writer's invention. In the early 1960s, a forbidden rumor circulated that a small amount of black-budget military cash had been moved through the island during its decommissioning. Whether or not a man truly survived a betrayal, there is a matter for the history books. But for Lee Marvin, the truth of the story was in the feeling of being discarded by the system you served. This leads us to the lost footage. In the original assembly of the film, there was a sequence where Walker returns to the empty apartment where he and Lynn lived before the betrayal. In this scene, he doesn't find clues, he finds silence. He sits on a bare mattress and begins to take apart his gun, piece by piece, and then puts it back together in total darkness. The studio executives found the scene too depressing and lacking in action, so it was excised. But if you look at the final cut, you can still see the remnants of that darkness in Marvin's eyes. He wasn't playing a hero, he was playing a man who had already seen the end of the world. Let's talk about the weird fact regarding the music, or rather, the lack of it. Most 1960s thrillers were drowned in brassy, James Bond-style scores. But Johnny Mandel, the composer for Point Blank, was instructed by Boorman to create a shimmering electronic atmosphere. At the time, synthesizers were primitive and experimental. The sound you hear during the more dreamlike sequences was intended to sound like the hum of the city. It makes the film feel incredibly modern, even today. It doesn't tell you how to feel. It just makes you feel uneasy. It's the sound of a high-voltage wire vibrating in the wind. And speaking of shimmering, we must look at the river of red that flows through the film. We mentioned the color palette before, but there is one specific detail that almost no one notices. Every time Walker gets closer to his money, the color red becomes more dominant in his environment. It starts with a red robe, then a red car, then a red wall. By the time he reaches the final confrontation, the money itself is contained in a bag with a red strap. To the aging American male, red isn't just the color of passion, it's the color of a warning light. It's the color of the red zone in combat. Walker is moving toward a target that he knows is a trap. He isn't walking into it because he's stupid. He's walking into it because he has nowhere else to go. There is a moment in the film that many veterans find particularly striking. It's the telescope scene we touched on earlier. Walker is looking at his enemy through a long-range lens. He has the chance to take a shot, but he doesn't. Why? It's because a professional doesn't kill for free. He kills for the objective. This level of discipline is something that has been lost in modern cinema, where protagonists often kill out of rage or emotion. Walker is a man of logic, albeit a violent singular logic. There's a weird behind-the-scenes fact about the actor who played the traitor, Mal Reese, John Vernon. To make the final confrontation between Walker and Reese feel authentic, Marvin refused to speak to Vernon off-camera. He wanted Vernon to be genuinely intimidated. During the scene where Walker dangles Reese over the edge of a balcony, Vernon was actually terrified. There were no safety nets, just Lee Marvin holding onto his shirt with those massive scarred hands. Marvin whispered to him, "If you move, we both go down." That's the kind of method acting that doesn't involve a trailer and a therapist. It involves gravity and grit. But the most disturbing fact about Point Blank involves its legacy. When the film was released in 1967, it was a box office disappointment. The public wasn't ready for a hero who was this cold. They weren't ready for an ending where the protagonist refuses the prize. It wasn't until years later, when the new Hollywood of the 1970s took over, that directors like Martin Scorsese and Steven Soderbergh began to cite it as the godfather of the modern thriller. The film captured a specific American anxiety, the realization that the good old days were dead and the new world was a cold glass labyrinth where a man's word meant nothing and the organization meant everything. For a 60-year-old man watching this today, the film feels like a eulogy for a type of masculinity that is no longer allowed to exist. It's a story about a man who refuses to be processed. As we close in on the final secret, we have to ask, what happened to The Rock after the film crew left? Legend has it that the production left behind a single prop, a dummy used for one of the falls, deep in the basement of the prison. Years later, tourists on the Alcatraz tour reported seeing a figure in the shadows of the lower levels. While it's likely just a ghost story to sell tickets, there is something poetic about it. A piece of point blank remains on that island, just as a piece of every man who has been betrayed remains in the place where it happened. Now, I want to leave you with a final thought before we wrap up. If you haven't seen Point Blank in a few years, watch it again. But don't watch it as an action movie. Watch it as a man looking for his soul in a world that says souls don't exist. Pay attention to the way Walker disappears into the shadows at the end. He doesn't die, and he doesn't win. He simply chooses to no longer participate in a game that is rigged. And that, perhaps, is the most dangerous lesson of all. You've stayed with us through the concrete halls of Alcatraz and the neon streets of LA. If this deep dive into the grit and the blank of 1967 resonated with you, it's probably because you remember a time when movies and men were built differently. If you appreciate this kind of cinematic, no-nonsense history, do us a favor. It doesn't cost $93,000, just a click on the subscribe button and the like icon. It helps us keep the organization from burying these stories. And tell us in the comments, what was the first Lee Marvin movie you ever saw? Was it The Dirty Dozen, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, or was it this haunting masterpiece? Don't let the organization win. Stay sharp, stay real, and we'll see you in the next one.